Hello. Well, we're starting part one of the Fugitive King. David, like us, has gone through problems, and all of us face problems, but hopefully not to the extent of David. His whole family, as far as his younger son, his oldest son Absalom, have turned against him. His friends, some of his advisors, are with Absalom, to the point that a rebellion has taken place, and now David is fleeing for his life. He's running away from Jerusalem. We're picking up in 2 Samuel chapter 15, and starting at verse 13, we see David receiving the news. The fact that Absalom's rebellion could spread so quickly and so widely lets us know just how discontented the people were with David as the king and his government. Being dissatisfied with the government, it's nothing new. Regardless of the country, regardless of the leader, there's going to be upsets, undercurrents, people saying things should be done better. And that's certainly the way it was with David. A lot of that was going on. The thing is, it was, let's get rid of the king. Let's bring on a new one. David recognized this, and he knew that there were a lot of reasons for it. But the main root of the problem could be traced back to his own sin with Bathsheba and the fact that he caused the death of her husband, Uriah the Hittite. So when news reached Jerusalem that the uprising was taking place, it caught David completely unprepared. He knew something was going on, but not to the extent of this. And it also caught his household, his family, all of his servants unprepared. And David wisely made the decision to leave Jerusalem so that this royal city, the place where God had appointed to put his name, would not be destroyed in the midst of the conflict. And when David considered that God's hand was upon him, and that now he was bringing the evil upon him from his own house, as had been prophesied by the prophet Nathan, no wonder he was scared. No wonder he was ready to leave. Verse 16 tells us that David went out with all of his households, but he left 10 concubines behind him. He left the royal harem, probably thinking, oh, they're women. Even the most barbaric of men would not violate them, and especially not Absalom. He would never be involved in an action of incest, especially when we consider what had just happened a few years ago to his own sister Tamar with their brother Amnon. He thought, these women are safe. I will just leave them. So it seems that David did not consider that the promised judgment concerning his household would come then, or at least not come this way. And verse 22 tells us that while David left those concubines, he was not about to leave the little ones. He knew that Absalom, should he become king, would never allow one who could be a potential heir to live. So David took the little ones along with him. In verses 17 through 22, it tells us that after leaving the royal family, they stopped outside the city for a while. Yes, it was very, very urgent that they get out of town, but David took time to have his royal bodyguard and all of his troops to walk in front of him for their review so that he could plan his next steps of action. And this is a principle that we need to learn. Take time to plan. It was in this planning stage when he took just that moment to do that and say, this is what I need to do, that he was able to go on. So David's troops, they were tough. They had experience. but still they were a lot smaller than Absalom's groups. Now, what about these men? Well, they were not all Israelites. They'd come from a lot of different countries. And originally, it was made up of David's band of rebels who fled with him from King Saul to the Philistine city of Gath. And then these men had followed him to Ziklag, to Hebron, and here to Jerusalem. So here we find them. Some 30 years later, many of these 600 men had been with him from the beginning. But it appears in all of these 600 people, there was a relative newcomer. A newcomer by the name of Ittai, who was a Gittite, also from Gath, but not necessarily one of the original ones. David used the term, well, you came with me only yesterday. Yeah, that was an obvious exaggeration, but it gives us a feeling that it wasn't as old as the others. Their relationship was not that long. The others had been with him about 30 years. Maybe Ittai had only been with him 5 or 10 years. But in doing this, he wanted to search out both his alliance to David and those of the men with him. And so he says, I'm going to just give you the opportunity to leave. One of the things about being hurt, when we have been hurt and we're still hurting, it's very hard for us to trust others. That's where David was. He knew his old friends had been with him, but this guy, these people, I don't know, they might not stick with me. Some of them may not have been with them much longer than his older son Absalom had. And he wanted to make sure that he could trust them again. And so what does he say? He said, return and remain with the king. Basically what he was saying was, go back to Absalom, who was made king by the choice of the people. I have been dethroned. I can no longer help you the way I wanted to, the way I intended to. So just go and stay with the king. Ittai, because he is a foreigner, is under no obligation to take part of any civil war that will be happening very soon. And so David suggests that he keep himself and all the other Gitteites out of the conflict. And then he blessed Ittai. And he prayed that God would show him mercy with blessings and also his faithfulness to him. David did two things here. First of all, he told others the cost involved in following him. Sometimes we want people to think, it'll just be easy because we need their help so desperately. And David was in desperate need of help. But he said, no, I want to be honest with you. There's going to be a civil war. You can stay here and not get involved. And the other thing he did was he blessed him regardless of his choice. Sometimes we feel like, if you go with me, I'll pray for you. If you're one of my people and one of my followers, I'll bless you. No, David says, I release you. And regardless of whether you stay with me or even if you go with my enemy, I want God to bless you because you are a good person. That's a heart like God. That shows that God is more interested in other people, and even in his time of need, than he is in himself. Ittai's response was, as the Lord lives. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound like a statement made by a Philistine. No, the Gittites, and especially Ittai, had learned from David They'd probably seen his examples, listened to his professions about God, and now Eli was very firm and said, as the Lord lives. And he declared his faith in and his commitment to the God of Israel. These are the words of the strongest oath, and they distinguish throughout the Old Testament a true believer. He says, I believe in God. And he says, as God lives, I'm making this promise. And then he goes on and he makes it a double oath when he says, as my Lord the King lives. He says, regardless of what happens, he says, I make this promise to God, and David, I am making it to you. He refused to turn back. And he pledges loyalty in the face of death. He says, whatever place you go, and whether it is in life or in death, I will be with you. Doesn't it sort of remind you of another foreigner who turned to follow the Lord and then made that commitment? Whether thou goest, I will go. Wherever thou lodgest, I will lodge. Yeah. He was making the same commitment to David that Ruth had made to Naomi. He said, regardless, life or death, I am going to be with you. Those words encouraged David. And David learned another principle, and that is, don't be afraid to trust again. We see this proven out in a couple of chapters later when, facing Absalom's body of rebels in action, David appoints Ittai as commander over 1/3 of his army. He says, I trust you. You have proven that I can trust again. They leave there. They leave Jerusalem and go on to where they're going to cross the Kidron Brook. And it says that everybody they passed wept. Probably Absalom and all of his followers were with him in Hebron. And so those that remained in or near Jerusalem, if they were not friends and supporters of David, at least they were sympathizers of how such terrible things could come upon so good and so great a king in such a small, quick amount of time. So David crossed over the Kidron Brook, which during the rainy season is a stream that separates the city of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. This is the same brook that Jesus went to. John tells us that he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden. The night that he was betrayed, Jesus also crossed over that very same creek. And from there, David would travel to the road leading through the wilderness of Judea and on down to Jericho and down to the Jordan River. But it was at the foot of the Mount of Olives that the Levites, which were headed by the Zadok the priest, put down the ark. They had brought the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they waited there until the high priest Abiathar and all the other people who would join David had come out of the city and were crossing over the brook. Abiathar and Zadok were the main priests during the time of David and very loyal to him. And knowing that David had such a zeal for God and how much he treasured the Ark of the Covenant and the presence of God, they brought the ark to accompany him on his journey. But David really felt the ark did not belong to him, but it belonged in Jerusalem. And it belonged in the place that he had built for it. And not only that, he was very confident that the priest, if they were to take the ark back, that they would be protected and respected because they were those in charge of the ark. And so they would be left unharmed. And he sent them back to Jerusalem. Why? Well, another reason he had was because returning the ark to the tabernacle where it belonged would be taking it back to God's presence. And he knew that he was the one that was going into exile, not the Lord. The symbol of God's presence with his people would remain in this place of worship for the entire community that was there. He said, there are going to be people that are still left in Jerusalem. God's presence will be there because God has promised to abide there. So despite his anxiety, despite his misery, David's acceptance of God's will and devotion to him never wavered. He believed if God wanted him and found favor with him, that one day God would let him return to see the ark and to see God's dwelling place again. But as much as he wanted that, David prepared himself because he knew that if God's decision was, I will not receive you back into my favor, nor will I restore you to your throne or to the city, and so that you can enjoy my ark and my presence again, that's it. David was ready. And that's it. When we submit to God's will, we have to be ready to accept his will regardless of his decision. We can't say, oh God, this is what I want and I want your will, but let me tell you how it's supposed to work out. No, David said, Lord, I'm ready. If you're pleased with me, you're going to receive me back. If you're not pleased with me, you're going to turn your back away from me. But either way, I want your will more than I want my will. That's a hard thing. So in verses 27 through 29, we see him taking another step, showing that he really trusts the Lord. By returning the ark, he did something else. He had a better opportunity to learn and to counteract Absalom's plot. This not only benefited him, but it was also, by returning the ark, it was a preservation of the ark and of God's law and of God's religion in Israel. You see, Absalom had already proven he was not a man of God. He'd already violated God's commands. He'd even used God's way of worship as the means to get his rebellion started. So to send the ark back was a matter of trust on the part of David. He said, I know for myself I can benefit from it, but more than that, I want to protect God, and I want his word protected. And so he directed Zadok and the others to go back as just, they were going to find out some things, but more than that, he says, I want you to go back in peace. I want you to go back as men of peace. He said, stop focusing on the war and start ministering entirely to God's service. David wanted the priest in Jerusalem to minister before the Lord, to be in a position that they could hear from him. And they also wanted them to be able to intercede for David. David said, maybe God will give you a word and you can send it back to me, and I'll wait here in the wilderness for it. Another principle is to make room for God to act. David could have just rushed out and said, you go back. And he said, no, he says, I I want you to do that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to wait. I don't know what's going on. Absalom's men could come after me at any time, but I'm going to wait right here until I hear from God. What a valuable lesson we all need to learn. During this time of danger, for a brief moment, the king seemed back to his old self. It seemed that in time of danger, more than any other time, that was when David cried out to the Lord, and he became the strong leader that God had intended for him to be. But one thing we got to know, and we have to learn, is that trust does not always mean joy. Verse 30 lets us know how the crowd proceeded with weeping, and all of the spectators and all of the procession, people of the procession, they went over the Kidron Valley with the brook, and they were all weeping. With David's head covered and going barefoot, these were just outward signs of his mourning. And the king chose to go barefoot and to walk rather than to ride, that he might humble himself before the Lord. And this also encouraged those who were with him in this hard and comfortless march. I mean, it was hard for them. These were city folk. Many of them, because they were with David, were probably old. Some of them were families with young children. This was a hard march. And David said, yeah, I'm going to be right in there with you. And also, seeing that he did that, raised their compassion for him, because they knew that he was feeling what they were doing. David's humility and resignation marked his deep sorrow, and also his humiliation and shame for his own sins. This was a very dark day for David and his kingdom. He had fallen. But it was the fall of the forgiven, a righteous one who would rise again. Now, submitting himself meekly to the will of God, he marched on, knowing that even though he was being chastised for his sins, God was with him. And in verses 31 through 37, as we end this chapter, we see a prayer that's answered. There was a need for a prayer meeting. You see, alarming news came to David that Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, and his chief advisor had switched parties. He had joined Absalom's conspiracy. Now, David knew that Absalom's judgment was very poor, and he might not succeed. But with the help of Ahithophel's wisdom, the scales just got tipped. There was a good possibility that he could. So what did David do? Did he just worry by himself and say, oh no, what am I going to do? No. He told the other people. He told his followers. He wanted to move them to the point that they would join with him in prayer against Ahithophel. And there's a couple of things we have to know here. He was going to pray against Ahithophel. You do not have to bless everyone you pray for. That sort of goes against us, doesn't it? Oh, we can love them, but we don't have to bless their actions. And that's what David was communicating to the people. He says, oh Lord, I pray that you will turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And he was either saying, confuse him so what he says is just completely off the wall, or let his counsel be rejected as foolishness so that people hear it and say, oh, that will never work. Or let them hear it and receive it, but then the way they carry it out, let it not matter. He says, I don't care, just turn it into foolishness. He let others know. So this was a public need, and he let them know their public need so that they could pray with him. And sometimes when we go through problems, even if others are concerned, we think we have to carry the whole load. David had enough of a load on his shoulder without adding one more. No, he recognized the importance of prayer support. And then he did more than just pray for his needs. This tells us that there on Mount Olives he worshiped. He took time not just to say, oh, God, meet my need, God, meet my need. No. He said, oh, God, you are glory. You are the lifter of my head. You are the God of Israel. You are the creator of heaven and earth, and all things belong to you. He took time to worship in the middle of that. And then, right after his prayer and worship, a very welcome sight greeted him. Hushai, David's friend and advisor, came to meet the king. And he came with his own robe torn and with dust on his head as a sign of his personal grief for the king. He offered to accompany David. He says, David, here I am, my friend. He says, I'm here, and I want to support you, and I'm going to be with you. But David recognized that the presence of another non-military person would bring more difficulties than help. And he explained to Hushai that he would only add to his burden and possible sorrow if something happened to him. And we have to be willing to refuse help, even if it comes from good friends. Not all people know how to give us the help we need at that moment. You know, it seems that Hushai was an old man, but he was more fit for counsel than for war. And so rather than having joined the troop, David knew that he could offer greater service to him in Jerusalem. David, 1 minute, he could pray and say, oh God, please help me. And the very next moment, when his prayer was over, he could help those prayers come true. And like David, sometimes we have a part in answering our own prayers. He could have just kept on praying and said, God, you'll send an answer. God, you'll take care of Ahithophel. No, he said, wait a minute. I prayed and asked God. Now, Hushai, this is how you're going to help me fulfill it. And so he had Hushai pretend that he had deserted David and that he wanted to join Absalom's group of conspirators. And he said, you can gain his confidence and perhaps you can even counteract the counsel of Ahithophel. And so David directed Hushai to say, O king, talking to Absalom, as I was your father's servant previously, so now I also will be your servant. This was something that Hushai was neither willing to do nor should he do. However, we don't know if this was something that was just added to David's list of offenses, or if it was a tactic of warfare, one that's often used today. Either way, it's something that God used. And we're going to see in the next session how greatly God did use this, how David's prayer was answered because he allowed others to help him. You see, he sent Hushai back to the city to act in concert with the priest. And These men were to relay information about Absalom to David through Zadok and Abiathar's sons. These men arrived in Jerusalem before Absalom did. And so Absalom had no idea that they had been in contact with the king. All of this took place because David was willing to trust others to act on his behalf. Wow. We learn a lot from the life of David. There's a lot of principles that, even though they're a few thousand years old, they're just as relevant for today. And as we study God's Word, as we study the people, we can know that as God was with David, as God helped David through his heartache, heartbreak, He will be with you in your times of trouble, in your dark times. Maybe you're going through dark days just like David did. God is with you. He'll give you the strength you need to trust Him again.